So, good afternoon. My name is Alister Chapman, and in the next 20 to 30 minutes, I'm going to give you a really quick rundown on some real-world HDR workflow based on some productions that I've done recently. So we're going to show a video to kick things off, and in the video, you're going to see some of the shots that I've used in my demonstration that I'm going to give you. These were shot with various cameras, shot with the F5 and R5 using RAW and XOCN, shot with an FS5 using hybrid log gamma, Sony Z90, tiny little camera, produces a really good picture. Again, with hybrid log gamma, that's the stuff you'll see that's in Norway in the Arctic. And then also some time-lapse of the Northern Lights that was shot with an A7S. So we've got a variety of cameras, different modes. We've got RAW, hybrid log gamma, time-lapse RAW, all mixed together in this video. And then afterwards, I'll explain exactly how it was all put together and how you produce an HDR video. So let's have a look at the video. So there's quite a bit of complicated switching and stuff that has to go on to make that happen on this big screen. The screen's set up for 8K video, but that was a 4K HDR video shot with these cameras. A couple of different projects that I was working on. The footage shot in the Forge was a film that I made for Fujinon, showing off their lovely MK lenses. So I've done a lot of things in HDR over the last couple of years, up in the Arctic, shooting Northern Lights and shooting things in very cold conditions. Also, as I say, the Fujinon project. And this was shot mainly with the Sony F5 with the R5 recorder using RAW. So what is HDR? Well, as you can see, this screen that we have here is really very, very bright. One of the biggest differences between standard dynamic range and HDR is to be able to show highlights much better. Now, something to understand with an HDR picture is the basic mid-range of your picture, your skin tones, anything that's darker than a white piece of paper, doesn't really change that much. We're not changing the mid-range, we are really just extending the range to be able to show much better highlights and also, to reproduce shadows better. So we have a bigger dynamic range, picture looks better, it just really looks nicer. It works with any resolution. Now, the standards for HDR are all based around 4K and above, but there is actually no reason why you can't do HDR in HD. And this is something a lot of broadcasters are actually interested in because it means they haven't got to change their infrastructure. If you want to do 4K, you've got to change your infrastructure. But to do HDR, it's just a case of encoding your files a little bit differently. Lots of interest in it from companies like Netflix, Amazon, Hulu. And one of the things to understand about this is that even if you're not a broadcast producer yourself, once your clients, if you're a corporate video producer or something like that, start seeing HDR, they're going to want it too. One of my clients is a car manufacturer, and they love HDR because it makes their shiny, fancy cars look even shinier. So when they're showing the videos in the showrooms, it gives them a nice little edge. So how do we put together an HDR program? It's not that difficult, but there are new steps and processes that you need to understand. Now, in the video, I've used a multitude of cameras. PXW Z90, little pocket handycam, that can shoot hybrid log gamma and HDR. The FS5, and obviously the new FS5 II as well, can shoot HDR with hybrid log gamma, or that camera could shoot with S-Log2, S-Log3, and then you can grade it to HDR, or we have F5, F55, Venice cameras like that, that again shoot log or raw, and you grade. So we do actually need to record our footage with a high-quality codec, because we are going to be using that full dynamic range from the camera, so it needs to be well recorded. So where possible, I would recommend RAW or XOCN. If you're using hybrid log gamma, it's a little bit more forgiving, and that actually works quite well with XAVC-L codec. We have two types of workflow when we're doing this. We have a more sort of traditional, perhaps, workflow where you shoot in something like RAW or log, XOCN, and then you grade that footage to give you the final image that you want, and then you deliver that. So that's a kind of a three-step process: shoot, grade, and deliver. But also, if we're shooting with hybrid log gamma, there is a much simpler instant HDR workflow that is just a two-step process. You simply shoot and edit, and that's it. There's no need to do any grading. There's no need to do anything special with the hybrid log gamma workflow. It's really very, very simple. So let's take a look at that one first: hybrid log gamma and instant HDR. Now, hybrid log gamma was developed by the BBC and NHK specifically for television. The other standard that we use, HDR10, PQ, ST2084, is evolved from a cinema standard. So this was designed from the beginning for TV. And that's one of the reasons why it's so much simpler and easier to use. You simply shoot with it and deliver it, and it has a degree of backwards compatibility with standard dynamic range TVs. So this is a representation here. The top image is what Rec 709, an ordinary standard dynamic range image, would look like on a standard dynamic range TV. And then below that, we have a representation of how hybrid log gamma would look on a standard dynamic range TV. It doesn't look that different. It's slightly flatter, slightly duller perhaps, but the audience would probably never notice that they were watching something a little bit different. But of course, if you have an HDR TV, that hybrid log gamma gets stretched back out to its full HDR range, and you get a lovely HDR image on the HDR TV, and it works for both people, SDR and HDR viewers, whether they have HDR or SDR TVs. So these are the cameras, or some of the cameras from Sony that have hybrid log gamma in them as standard: the FS5, Z150, NX80, Z90, and there are more cameras being added to this selection as we go along. To use hybrid log gamma, well, we have to select the hybrid log gamma curve in the camera, and these are in the picture profiles in these camera. It's in picture profile number 10. And once we're in that picture profile, we have some choices that we need to make. The first one is, which of the hybrid log gamma curves do we choose? These all look the same. They're just designed to be used in different shooting circumstances. So hybrid log gamma number 1 works really well in low light scenes, but it has slightly less dynamic range to get a lower noise picture. Then we have hybrid log gamma number 3 at the other end, which is really good for bright exteriors. It has the biggest dynamic range, but it's a little bit noisier as a result. But if you're shooting a bright scene, you won't see that noise. So within your production, you might mix and match these. If you were doing weddings, you might start off inside the church using hybrid log gamma number 1 in the lower light level, and then you go outside, and then you would switch to hybrid log gamma 3, and that's going to give you the best possible image. The exposure is very slightly different to 709. We want to expose our levels a little bit lower, and I'll come on to that in a moment. So here we are in the picture profile settings in the camera, and it's simply a case of choosing the log gamma, hybrid log gamma curve that you want. Then for exposure, if you set your zebras to 70%, which is the default in these cameras, you would use 70% on a white target, so a white piece of paper, a white shirt, or something like that. Your other option is to use skin tones as your exposure reference, in which case you'd want to set the zebras somewhere between 55 and 60%, depending on how bright you like your skin tones to be. Now, this is being recorded, so I know I'm rushing through this quite quickly. You will be able to go onto the Sony website to refresh your memories if there's information in this that you've missed, perhaps. I do recommend that you use an HDR monitor when you're shooting HDR, but with hybrid log gamma, because it does work on ordinary 709 standard dynamic range TVs and monitors as well, it's not absolutely necessary. It is perfectly possible to shoot HLG without an HDR monitor. But these Atomos monitors are pretty cheap, so I would recommend perhaps looking at one of those. Now, another thing that we have in the cameras is something called Viewfinder Gamma Display Assist, and that allows us to convert from hybrid log gamma to 709 just for the viewfinder. And that makes judging your exposure and everything even easier, because you actually just see a standard definition, or sorry, standard dynamic range image in the viewfinder. Now, something to consider, and this is a slightly abstract workflow. If we really want backwards compatibility with a 709 standard dynamic range TV, we might want to think about using a different color space to the one you would normally use for HDR. So normally for HDR, you use 2020 color space, which is a larger color space. But if you want your hybrid log gamma instant HDR footage to look great on a standard dynamic range TV, you're actually going to have to use 709 color for that particular application to give you that full backwards compatibility. And an HDR TV should be perfectly capable of showing 709 color combined with hybrid log gamma. But it's not a defined workflow as such, but it does work perfectly well, and this is how you get the best backwards compatibility. Normally, though, you'd shoot with 2020. So this is from the Z90 camera, shot in UHD, hybrid log gamma, lovely sky scenes. The fire in the campfire looks really good. Use the best codec that you can with it, whichever camera that you're using. Now, looking at the post-production side of things, how do we work with this? Well, it's actually really easy. You just edit it in your existing edit platform. You don't need to change anything. The edit platform just sees it as a video clip, so you just edit it, export it, and then you'll have a file in hybrid log gamma. I will come on to the delivery and export side of things in a little bit more detail later on. Now, looking at the other type of workflow we have now, so this isn't hybrid log gamma now, we're going on to that workflow where you shoot and capture the biggest dynamic range that you can with log or with raw or something like that, then you grade it, and then you deliver it. Now, it's a little bit more complicated, this workflow, but it does give you much more control over the final image, and if you have the time and you have the ability, this is the workflow that I prefer for HDR, just because you have the ability to fine-tune those pictures. Again, it's all about capturing that biggest dynamic range. We don't want to change the way we expose, actually, because the mid-range of our shot, skin tones, faces, people, is still always going to be the most important part of an image. So we expose just the same for hybrid, for log and for raw for HDR as we would for standard dynamic range. And my preference actually with the F5, S7, F55 is to actually shoot about 1 stop brighter than Sony actually recommend to get a nice, clean, low noise picture. But with the Venice camera, that camera is so clean, so little noise in it, you can just shoot at 500 ISO base without any problems. Now, to be able to work with this workflow, you definitely need an HDR monitor. There's not a way to do it without. So you really need to think about monitoring and stuff like that for this workflow to work. Now, one of the things, though, that makes this a lot easier is something called a color-managed workflow. Now, normally, as a quick show of hands, how many of you here shoot with log or with raw or something like that now? Quite a few of you. How many of you use LUTs to make the picture look the way you want? An awful lot of you. And that's perfectly normal, and that is very typical. But when we're working with this type of workflow, that can be complicated because we might want to output different versions. We might need to do an HDR version and an SDR version. So a color managed workflow will take care of a lot of the conversion between what we shoot and what we deliver. So I highly recommend them. Now, one of them is the ACES Academy of Motion Pictures Color Encoding System workflow, and this is a really good workflow, although it is quite processor intensive, and I'm quickly going to go through how you would set that up in DaVinci Resolve, and it's very easy. We go into Resolve's color management settings, and we simply change the color science to ACES CC. You can just about see it up there. That enables this color managed workflow. And then we select the correct input transform, which is basically telling Resolve what you shot it with. And then you select the output transform that you want, which is basically telling Resolve how you want it to be exported. And all the complicated conversions and the mathematics and everything else happens within Resolve. You don't need to worry about lookup tables and LUTs or any of that stuff. It's all going on inside Resolve. Much, much easier for many things. Also works perfectly well for a standard dynamic range workflow too. It's not just for HDR. But the workflow I tend to use the most is DaVinci's own color managed workflow, DaVinci YRGB color managed. So once again, we go into our project settings, and instead of ACES or the normal workflow, we select DaVinci YRGB color managed. And then again, we tell DaVinci Resolve what we shot it on by, in this case, I've selected S-Log3. But that could be S-Log3, it could be hybrid log gamma, it could be RAW, many different things. So we tell Resolve what we shot it with, and then again, we tell Resolve what we want to set our timeline to. And normally this will match what you shot it on, or perhaps you might want to use linear, depends on your personal preferences. Generally, I make the timeline match what I shot. And finally, the last step again is to set how you want your file to be exported. Because one of the great things about this is that we can set output to ST2084 for an HDR10 PQ workflow. And when you're done, if you then need to do a standard dynamic range version, you just change the output settings to Rec 709, and it will convert it to 709 instead in standard dynamic range. Far easier than having to change all your LUTs. Now, what if you have a mix of clips from different cameras? Well, that's no problem either, because you can select individual clips in the timeline, or you can go into the media bin, the media pool, and select a range of clips and set them to their own input color space. And actually, this is really good if you've got different cameras from perhaps even different manufacturers and you want them all to look the same. This will sort that out. So it's a really good workflow to understand, even if you're not doing HDR. Now, another thing that you might run into is if you're using a television as your monitor, an HDR TV, many TVs won't go into their HDR mode unless they receive the correct signals down the HDMI cable that says this is HDR. And we can enable that signaling within Resolve by going to the project settings, to the master settings, and enabling HDR metadata over the HDMI. This only works, though, if you've got a dedicated video card. It doesn't work with the desktop graphics card. You have to have a proper, like a Blackmagic SDI card or something like that. Another thing, if you're doing ST2084 or the HDR10 standard, is to set up the scopes in Resolve to show you the levels of brightness that you will be displaying your pictures at. So we go into our preferences, and we set enable HDR scopes to ST2084, and then our scopes look like this, where the scale along the side is our brightness in nits. And with HDR10, we want white to be around 100 to 250 nits, in that sort of region, and then our highlights for the typical range of TVs that are available today will be about 1,000 nits. And we can use the scopes then to judge how bright and how dark our picture will be. And we can also look at the scopes to judge whether it's a good HDR image. Because one of the things you can't do with an HDR television is have the entire screen at its maximum brightness. Televisions have to meet certain green regulations in terms of power consumption and things like that. And those standards are actually based around standard dynamic range. If you have a TV that can do 1,000 nits and you try and make that whole screen that bright, you will exceed the power restrictions of the TV. It won't be able to do it. So you have to balance your picture with a mix of light and dark to get that really nice contrast, so you don't overload the TV, you don't make it overheat, you don't make it use too much electricity. So when we look at this waveform here, this is actually quite a good HDR image because there's both light and dark. So I can have some of my screen really, really bright because that's offset by some of the screen being quite dark, and that's going to give me a really good HDR image. This image here as well is a reasonably good HDR image. Above 100 nits, which is my white level, there's not too much, so the TV will be able to generate that picture quite well, quite easily. This example here, though, is not a good idea. Trying to shoot snow scenes and things like that in HDR is actually very challenging because you can't have the entire picture all being very bright at the same time. So something like this, you've got to be really careful with how you shoot, how you compose, and don't try and make the snow 1,000 nits. It would look wrong anyway. It wouldn't be very pleasant to watch. Now, how do we output our HDR? Well, one of the things, again, that we need to switch a lot of televisions into their HDR mode is something called metadata embedded within the video file. We also want to change the codec that we're using. I'm sure a lot of you use MPEG-4, H.264 right now to put your video file on a little USB stick. You plug it in the TV, and that plays back just fine. But for HDR, we want 10-bit. So we want to use H.265, and it's the H.265 codec that is the normal codec to use for an HDR production. And then on top of that, we need to add the metadata flags that make the TV go into the correct mode, whether that's 709, hybrid log gamma, or HDR10. Now, looking at Adobe Premiere and Adobe Media Encoder for a minute, and this is Lucifer, my pet chameleon here. HDR10 flag can be added in in Media Encoder very easily. When you select the HEVC codec, you can see right there on the far side of the screen that we have the ability to tick a box for Rec 2020 and then another box for HDR, and that will be flagged as HDR10. So anything for ST2084 and HDR10, you should do this. Do not do this, though, for hybrid log gamma, because the picture will end up looking wrong on the TV. So at the moment, we have support for HDR10, but not HLG within Media Encoder. This is Apple's compressor, obviously limited to a Mac, but this allows you to encode using HEVC now, and we can select various options for our metadata flags. We can have hybrid log gamma, we can have 2020 color, we can have hybrid log gamma with 709. Lots of different combinations that you can add, and I really like the way that this is currently implemented. It's one of the easiest ways to add this metadata. Now, another option, if you're on a PC, is to use FFmpeg. But this is getting pretty serious now. This is not the most straightforward of things to work with. This is a GUI application that allows you to run FFmpeg from a GUI, which I personally find similar. And this is a setup for hybrid log gamma. The transfer characteristic there, arbitrary standard B67 is HLG. And then we have all these numbers in here. And actually what these numbers do is they tell the television how the monitor that you graded on was set up so that the TV can try and mimic your grading monitor, and as a result, the picture will look as close as possible to what you were seeing in the grading suite. But this is really getting into the real sort of complexities of HDR when you start doing this stuff. You don't have to do that. So that is basically it. There are new things to consider, there are new things to learn, but it isn't that difficult. You don't need to have all those color coordinates and stuff like that. You just need to understand that there's a few little new extra tick boxes that needed to be selected to put the metadata into your file. In terms of grading, if you have an HDR monitor in your grading suite, it really is very simple, very straightforward, especially if you use that color managed workflow. It takes away the complexity of trying to use LUTs and convert things and stuff like that. The software does it all for you. And I do recommend that as well as a good HDR production monitor, you have an HDR TV in the grading suite, because you'll find that HDR TVs do tend to behave a little bit differently to a production monitor. Production monitor is set in a very specific way, but HDR TVs tend to have a lot of auto functions to try and enhance the picture and make it look better. So I recommend that you have both. So I hope that was useful to you. I hope there was some useful information in there. As I say, this is being recorded, so you can go online later on. Not quite sure when it'll be available, and have a look if there's anything you need to refresh yourself on. So thank you for listening. Do enjoy the rest of the show, and I will be doing this again tomorrow. And if you want to know more about HDR, Hugo from Sony does a really good presentation, and I think his is at 11 o'clock each day. Thank you.